Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Gian-Carlo Carra. I am the City Councillor for Ward 9 and a candidate for re-election in Ward 9 in October 18th's municipal election. And it's going to be a big one in the history of our city. I think this is going to be one where historians talk about a pivot point, and where we go is really a open conversation. Where we decide to go together is really an open conversation. And that's really what's driving this conversation series. And so to everyone who's online, watching live, thank you for joining us on this beautiful but slightly smoky Sunday morning. And to everyone who's watching recorded, hopefully this conversation and the other conversations in this series help inform the story you tell yourself and the values that you bring when you head into the ballot box in October. Speaking of stories that we tell ourselves, I want to take this opportunity to do a land acknowledgement. And I want to sort of be very clear about what we're trying to do as municipal politicians when we do land acknowledgements. I've had the opportunity to speak at vigils against Islamophobia over the last couple months, to speak at celebrations of different ethno-cultural communities, celebrating their contributions to Canadian pluralism. And what I find myself saying is that the story I tell is very much the same, is that when we do a land acknowledgement, we are reinterpreting our history. We are telling ourselves a different and better story. We are decolonizing Canadian history. And what we say here in Treaty 7 is that our settlement of this land together as an expression of Canadian pluralism is really the result of a peace treaty that was signed with the signatory First Nations of Treaty 7. And, broadly speaking, they were the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot people, the Aye Nakota, the Stoney Nakota people, the Tsuut'ina people. And these three different groups with their own First Nations subdivided in there were very distinct people with very different languages, very different traditions, very distinct cultures. And they, over time, came to an accommodation to share this land together and to build community. And they were joined by the Métis with their long history on this land, and they've been joined since then by urban Aboriginals from across Turtle Island to build community here with Euro-Canadians and now Canadians from all over the world as we pursue Canadian pluralism. And that's really what we're doing. We're saying that the history of this place did not start 150 years ago with the arrival of white settlers. It began in time immemorial with different people coming together to share the land and build community. I'm hoping today that we can not only decolonize the story that we tell ourselves, but we can also demasculinize, we can feminize, we can seek equality across the gender spectrum and celebrate diversity in all of its amazing contribution to our collective project of civilization here on Treaty 7 land and here as Canadians. I'm joined today by two really amazing people, Associate Professor of History at the University of Calgary, Nancy Janovicek, and Chair of the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee of the City of Calgary, Danisha, Bhaloo, Shivji. Both of these amazing, powerful, activist women are really at the forefront of gender equity and diversity. And gender equity and diversity is sort of a baseline of work that we're now standing on as we pursue anti-racism and we seek to dismantle the systemic racism that recently we've acknowledged thanks to world events. So without further ado, I will just say good morning to both of you. Thank you for joining me. And we sort of agreed that we would ask the expert here in the room, Associate Professor Janovicek, to basically give us a little bit of a rundown about how we got here. So as we look at the history of our little project of civilization here, on, on the Canadian prairie, on the eastern slopes of the mountain. Give us the history of gender equity and diversity that arrive us at this moment, Nancy, if you will.
Thanks for that introduction, Giancarlo. So I'm in less than 10 minutes, hopefully much less than 10 minutes. I'm going to tiptoe.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Tiptoe through, some history about women's engagement in politics, but focusing on first achieving the vote or fighting for the vote. And then I will move into talking about like how women were organizing in what we call the second wave, even though I argue against that first wave and second wave in my lectures. And I think it's important to understand the history because one of the pieces of intersectional theory that's really important to remember is that Crenshaw argued that it is the historic roots of these inequities that we need to understand as well, right? So these histories have ongoing legacies in our politics today. And so the other thing I want to do in this quick little survey of women's activism that's more Canadian than just in this space is to also challenge this idea that a lot of my students have and a lot of people have, that these were white middle class movements. Now, that's not to say that they that white middle class women didn't have more of a voice. They certainly did. But I also think it's really important to challenge that narrative because there were racialized women and there were Indigenous women fighting for the vote and fighting for a stronger say in electoral politics alongside the politics of their communities. And then I'm going to move into talking about the rise of the new right and women's engagement and the rise of the new right, because this is where the challenge to women being at the center of policy making and about how we develop policy that will promote gender equity begins in the neoliberal moment of the 1970s and the 1980s. So quickly on suffrage, right? I mean, one of the narratives is they were just a bunch of white middle class women, and why do we study them? Well, because we need to understand how those white middle class women entrenched unequal relationships among women, right? And also established and enforced or reinforced and reproduced those racial hierarchies and the class hierarchies, right? So the way that sort of internationally historians are thinking about the suffrage movement is to get away from the women got the vote here first, that kind of celebratory narrative, to understand that the politics of the movement in sort of, I'm going to use the language of the global politics were very much rooted in imperialism and in white supremacy, right? And so this global movement to achieve the vote, and women from Canada were traveling to Europe and other places to work with British women and other women to win the vote. But the idea of these international movements was that women would have the same votes, would get suffrage on the same terms as men. And that usually meant white men, right? And so what that means here, if we're thinking about how we're going to build those narratives and think about suffrage here, is that base was based on property rights, right? John A. Macdonald argued that suffrage should protect minority rights. And for Macdonald, the minority were the property owners. And so the fight for property for middle-class white women was connected to the desire to vote. Now, what does property mean in Western Canada and in Canada? It means the dispossession of lands from Indigenous people, right? And so Sarah Carter, who has a relatively new book out about suffrage, she teaches at the University of Alberta, she looked at the prairies and the struggle for suffrage in the prairies. And she has this interesting sort of suggestion that one of the reasons that property rights might have been so difficult for women to achieve in the prairie provinces is because this was a Métis space at the time that this was being produced. Métis women, it was an Indigenous space, right? But Métis women were married to prominent white men, Lougheed being one example, right? And so that she feels might be informing this, and it's something that she suggests we look much more into. The other thing that I want to make, point that I want to make is that we haven't studied suffrage for about 30 years. It's just starting again. And what we're learning is that there were racialized women and there were Indigenous women who wanted the vote in order to advance right equality for their communities. And here I'm talking about racial and gender equality. And so there's a really great suffrage series by UBC Press that is meant for a popular audience, but they're very good. And so one of the questions that Joan Sangster asks is, what does our understanding of the fight for women's suffrage look like if we start with Marianne Shadd Carey rather than with those middle-class women in the Toronto society that we usually do? And for those of you who don't know, I was raised in Southwestern Ontario and Munsee, Delaware Territory. And Marianne Shadd Carey was an abolitionist. She was a Black woman. She was an editor of a very, very important abolitionist newspaper in the 1880s. And she was an advocate for universal suffrage. So for all men and all women, regardless of property ownership. And another person that I've learned about is Edith Montour, who was of the Mohawk Nation, and she was a nurse in the First World War, which meant that she got to vote in that first election when they gave nurses the vote. And she maintained her right to vote as well as her status, right? So we're starting to learn that this was a much more diverse movement. And then, one of the important places where women were very active initially was in municipal politics, because this is where the issues that women were concerned about primarily as mothers were taken care of, right? So education, milk and clean water, daycare was initially a municipal issue, and child welfare. And all of these issues were things that motivated Annie Gale, who was the first woman on our city council to get involved in politics. Now,
also one of the first, by some readings, one of the first women in the British Commonwealth to achieve elected office.
Yeah, one of the first. The first is in New Zealand, but one of the first for sure. Yeah.
Well, we'll concede that.
Okay. So, of course, these movements were often led by privileged white women, and often they reproduced racial and class relationships that were unequal. But again, we're starting to learn more about Black women and Chinese women or Chinese communities, right, who were fighting and developing their own services for their communities because they were they were excluded from a lot of these programs, right? So as we're learning more about this wave or this period of women's organizing, we're needing to kind of challenge this idea that it was white and middle class, right? And one of my colleagues, Nancy Forestella, is doing this work, right? We haven't looked for them because we've assumed that they're not there in the archive, and we're finding out that they were. So the question that we're asking ourselves is, what have we refused to see when we go to the archives? So my final point is this wasn't an easy victory. It took many, many years, especially in the prairies. It was a 70-year struggle here for the vote. And so we do need to bear that in mind. Okay, so now I'm going to just skip over to the second wave. And again, the narrative there is that in the 1970s, it was a white middle-class women. And again, I tell my students that this erases Indigenous women, this erases Black women, this erases interseed who were fighting for their citizen rights. They were the international workers who came here to do childcare, right? And it erases the work of working class women and living in poverty. I'm going to talk about a couple of grassroots organizations. One was the Just Society movement. These were welfare activists. These were women, both of whom started it, who lived in abusive relationships. And before shelters were open, they managed they did leave their homes, but they organized a very militant group of welfare activists to demand their rights, right? And so what they would do is they would set up shop outside of the horrible welfare, the people who were denying welfare access, and they would embarrass those officers at that local level, right? And these kinds of local pieces of activism were challenging like all of these inequalities that were rooted in state policy. I also want to talk about the Indian Homemakers Association and acknowledge that this is the work of my colleague and friend, Sarah Nichols, who is of the Clemson Nation. I'm sorry, I can't say that again, but it was DIA sponsored, right? So this was the Department of Indian Affairs trying to assimilate Indigenous women. So they used that money and those funds to demand control over education, child welfare, and all of their activism, as again, was rooted in the residential schools and in the 60s scoop, right? So I'm not equating, I don't want to equate Indigenous women's activists with municipal politics, but again, a very local grassroots group of women who were really subverting what the Indian Act did to the status of Indigenous women. the point here is, again, these are now, by the second wave, you've got municipal politics also looking to the state to advance equality. And here I'm talking about the federal government and the provincial government. This is happening then at the same time as the rise of the new right, right? And these women were very, very, very much engaged in neoliberal politics in the 70s and especially in the 80s. And one organization here was the Alberta Federation of Women United for the Family. They were actually the inspiration for REAL Women. And Phyllis Schlafly, if you watch that great documentary, was at their founding meeting. So they were part of this transnational group of women who had connections to the anti-abortion movement. Their activism was homophobic, and they were about defending the traditional family. And all of their policies were very much rooted in, as my honor student Jewel Bohach argued, in white supremacy, right? And in defending that particular family form. And so again, what they were also arguing was that—
Can you give us a date for that? Just
AFWA starts in about 82, 83.
Okay. So that's sort of like with Thatcherite and Reagan.
Yeah.
The rise of
all of those policies. Yeah. And I mean, eventually some of them are married to conservative MLAs, but, and you know what? the Lagrange family was very much involved, very much Red Deer. And so the Lagrange's sisters-in-laws and were very involved in this organization as well. So, I mean, I think the reason I wanted to talk about the new right is because I think this is contributing to the lack of representation, or the decreases, right, in representation of women today, right? So these were parallel movements, and there's a lot of really interesting work going on about understanding the new right and their emphasis on choice, right? But of course, choice that's undermining demands for a universal daycare system, right? Choice very much in ways that are going to support the traditional family form. So I guess a couple of takeaways. I'm going to finish by talking about, why I think understanding history is really important to understanding the world we're living in and helping us to envision the future that we're trying to build, right? And the important message here is the ongoing legacies of the histories that are rooted in genocidal policies and are also rooted in white supremacy and in promoting unequal class relations and a capitalist system, right? The other important message I think that I want to think about, and this is coming out of the scholars who wrote that suffrage series that I've been talking about, is that their activism in the past was imperfect, and we have to remember that ours was too. So that as we move forward, especially for white settler women like myself, we need to come to our activism with humility as we're building coalitions and the relationships that we really need to work together for a better future, right? And we need to kind of bring this history with us to think about how we're going to build those coalitions to influence municipal politics. Thanks.
That was a tour de force. I really appreciate it, Nancy, and that sort of sets a really important stage. Nancy knows, of course, that my first degree was in her department at the University of Calgary in history, and I view everything from a historical lens. I feel like if you have no idea where you came from, you can't really understand where you are. And then you can't even begin to forge ahead into the future. Let's talk about where we're at. And maybe if I could put you on the spot, Danisha, as a woman of color who is, playing a leading activist role, can you tell us maybe a more personalized history about your journey and how you have come to chair our Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee and what that's all about? And I've got a lot to say about that too, because it's deeply tied to the work that I've done with gender equity and diversity over the last several years as the city councilor for Ward 9. But jump in right now and give us a little window into your story and how it arrives us at this moment also.
For sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think I premised with Gian-Carlo when I was invited that I am not an expert or a thought leader on history, but I have lived experience, and that's what I can speak to. So I don't propose to speak on behalf of all racialized women and their experiences, but I can absolutely share what I've been through. And even just growing up, I think intersectionality has been very important to me. And I'm not going to lie, I think growing up until the last couple of years, I've been maybe ignorant or naive about what that really means and how it affects me and my family. And really what's happened over the last year over the pandemic has reinforced a lot of that learning, which I think it has with a lot of people when you talk about Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, it really put me in a position to have to, and I hope a lot of others, to reflect. And I think that's the start of learning and moving forward in progress. For me specifically, I can share that I'm a second generation Canadian. My parents immigrated here from Africa, went through hardships in the 70s, coming here during the Idi Amin crisis, and Trudeau allowing their families to come in, and feeling really grateful. And I think that's also part of the story of how I feel, and this generation of my families feel. We have big families right now that live in Canada, and we're grateful to be able to live in Canada. And we absolutely abide by the notion of pluralism and diversity, and especially pluralism. When you think about there's a global center for pluralism in Ottawa that is in Canada, that's been established here. And I don't think a lot of people know about that. But I think that's really the focus of conversation moving forward. And what does pluralism even mean? And how does it intersect with equity and diversity and inclusion? I think for me specifically, I was born in Calgary, which my husband likes to remind me of because I've lived in Edmonton for the last 20 years, but I am Calgarian.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Thank you. I was born in Calgary, but for me, we moved to Edmonton when I was very young due to family circumstances. My parents separated. My mom's family lived in Edmonton, so it just made sense for us to move there. When I was very young, my dad unexpectedly passed away when he was 40 years old, and I was 12 from a heart attack. And that really threw us in the lens of poverty, which is another intersection for us. And having to go through my childhood and my teenage years, working 2 jobs, having a single parent who worked 3 jobs to put roof over our head, try to give us the best that she could as a racialized first immigrant woman herself, first generation.
What jobs did she do? Can I ask that question of you?
Absolutely. She was a property manager in Calgary for a very long time, 30 years. But when we moved to Edmonton, she continued that job, but she supplemented with other retail jobs, whether it was working at a restaurant, hotels, like events that happened at night. She would work till 2 a.m. often. We would live on tip money more than anything because she wasn't making a lot. But she'd be home at 2 a.m. And then when I was very young, we started doing newspaper routes that started at 4 a.m. So I have a distinct memory of waking up at 4 when I was 13 years old, and my 8-year-old sister asleep in the backseat of the car, and we go do newspaper routes every morning. At the time, she did say it was to instill hard work in me, which I think is part of it helped. But looking back now, I know it was because we were penny pinching and every penny counted. I worked my first job when I was 14. I think it was legal then at that time. Like I could start when I was 14 at a Subway. But again, all the money that I earned went towards food and helping to pay our rent. When I think that influenced a lot of what I was feeling when I moved to Edmonton. My self-esteem was low. My self-confidence was low. I was failing school. And that all resulted out of being bullied. And now when I look back 20 years later, I can confidently say I was being bullied because it was racism. Although at the time I probably couldn't say that because I just didn't see how I was different or that the color of my skin was the reason why I was being bullied. But now I can confidently say that was part of the reason. And that affected me. And then a couple of years later, when my dad passed away, it just added more pressure on our family. I was fortunate enough that my mom had the foresight to use community resources and services. So organizations like United Way, like the food bank, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, where I work right now, they're the ones that got me to where I am today, allows me to sit here and have you, even though I don't know if I necessarily believe it, calling me a social impact leader, although I strive for that every day, because I know firsthand the direct impact these organizations have had on my life. Without having a big sister, a mentor in my life to instill that value of self-confidence, self-esteem in me, I would still be suffering from that.
Can you tell us a little bit about your big sister, just because I'm super interested about it?
Absolutely. Her name is Barb. We still keep in touch 25 years later. She was matched with me when I was 10 years old, stayed with me till the end of the program, which you age out at 18. So she was my big sister for about 8 years formally, but we still kept in touch. After that, while we were together, she invited me to her wedding when I was 16 years old. I still have a picture of that. I invited her to my wedding a couple of years ago. When I ran for city council in Edmonton 5 years ago, she was a super big support for me. She lives in Saskatchewan, so she wasn't there in person, but she endorsed me. She shared her perspective of me and growing up and what my experience was like as a child and as a youth. But like I said, it's for me, I think it was very much having someone that wasn't your family member, wasn't your mom, wasn't your sister, someone who had to love you and who had to believe in you. Having a stranger do that and do it for the reasons because they got to know you and they believed in your vision, your purpose, what you could do to make a difference in the community. And I think that's what I appreciated was she was there as a volunteer. She didn't have to be there, but she was there because she wanted to be and she stayed, which I think is very important for especially young people right now, is having that consistent role model in their life. Because oftentimes having a positive role model is great, but if you're changing every year and there's just that inconsistency there, sometimes it's hard. And there's a lot of research that shows that kids try to test adults in their lives by seeing if they'll stay, if they test them or try to retract from them. But she stayed. And I was definitely one of those kids who tested her and she stayed. So for me, that was really important to me to build up my self-esteem and self-confidence. And then, yeah, that was the premise, the foundation of who I am today. If I hadn't had that self-confidence, that self-esteem, if I hadn't even had the organization that provided me opportunities to go to university, that like I got a full scholarship to go to university. Otherwise, I could confidently say I wouldn't have been able to afford a post-secondary education at that time. I wouldn't be where I am today. And I studied criminology because I think for me, it was very personal. If I hadn't had these opportunities, I was very much at risk because I can say that I thought about shoplifting. I thought about not dangerous crimes, but shoplifting to survive. And I'm very empathetic to people who live in poverty that are doing the very best they can to put food on the table, because I know what that's like. And some of the social issues and the foundation around that. So for me, becoming an adult into my 20s, finishing university, having the confidence to run for city council, which I know we'll talk about later on around women in politics and leadership, that shaped the person that I am. And that, again, I think over the last few years after I ran, I've really had to reflect. I've been forced to reflect upon what are the experiences I had and how does that systemic, not just my experiences as an individual, but other racialized women running in politics and what can they expect or what should they be prepared for? Not that I'm saying that they should be prepared for anything, but if you want to be, I find women are planners. They want to be prepared. They want to be people that know what's coming in most cases. And no matter how unfair the system is, you have to be prepared for what you're going to get, because you have to have it, like, Gian-Carlo, you have to have a thick skin. But I think especially for women, you have to have a thick skin because they deal with so many more difficult issues around fundraising, balancing motherhood and career, or being a politician, harassment. Like there's all of these things that women face at a different level than others.
So yeah, thank you for sharing with us. That's I feel like I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you better in the context of this conversation. I'm sure everyone who's listening to this do too. Talk to me about the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee. So you come to Calgary, you come back to Calgary, and you step up onto a official board commission of the city of Calgary, and your resume rises to the top, and we appoint you to this newly formed committee as city council, and you become the chair. Talk to me about that, both the committee and your experience there.
Absolutely. So when I moved back to Calgary a couple of years ago, I've always been involved in the social impact sector, not just in a professional way, but in a voluntary way. So that's part of who I am, and that's part of the community I've grown up in. So it was kind of natural for me to look for opportunities in Calgary, not just personally for me to connect to the city that I know I'm going to be spending a lot of time in, but how I can make a difference in the community where I live. And moving to Calgary after getting married and being a mom right away to change my perspective as well, because it's not just about me now, it's about my daughter and what is she going to live through She's only 18 months, but I think every day about what kind of life she's going to have in Calgary, and the opportunities that will be afforded to her. That's
I mean, yeah. I mean, with not only sort of like this sort of like rising incidence of overt racism as we call out systemic racism, but also, you know, as we breathe smoke from, you know, climate change induced mega fires. It's just, as the father of a 9-year-old son, I share the same question. Like, what kind of world are we bequeathing to our children?
For sure. Absolutely. And in our household, like my husband is a sustainability expert. And so we're having these conversations around climate change and the effect on future generations, but also social impact and my lived experience and not living in poverty, but like even her going to school and who is she going to meet? And the fact that I was bullied as a child, like how are we going to deal with that if she's going to be bullied as a child, or if she instigates, which is something we obviously want to teach her not to do. But especially she was a COVID baby. So all of this kind of came together during the pandemic, during this racial shadow pandemic as well. And the fact that being a new mom, when there's all this talk about a feminist economic recovery because of the challenges that women have faced over the last year, specifically about losing their jobs. The social impact sector is 70% women working here, even though it's interesting that more men serve on boards in different nonprofits than women do. When you talk about actual workers in the nonprofit sector, they're 70% women. So the fact that the pandemic has challenged working women, working mothers, and put them a step back, I think that's especially true for women and mothers who are working the social impact sector. So we talk about that all the time. And I think that I was sitting on the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee as a member for a year before I became chair. And the first year was a lot of learning for me, not just about the city of Calgary and the social wellbeing policy and how administration implements that policy through all of the programs that it does, but
or seeks to, because it is definitely an imperfect process that we're starting to ramp up.
Absolutely. And I've shared this too. I think my biggest learning, especially as chair, has been the intention is there from all parties, administration, community, city council. But there seems to be, and this is not just for this, but for everything. I've seen this in the social impact sector, a lack of communication, a lack of working together, a lack of sharing best practices, and then implementing on them. Because I think a lot of times we talk about what's right and what we should be doing, but there's not really a follow-up plan or an action plan or something tangible to be doing that.
Well, and you know, I think what you're describing there is a system,
yeah,
which is what we have to sort of break and change, and that's the whole freaking point. But it's very difficult to change systems because, you know, they're set up to be systemic and to function beyond individual actors. And you know, the thing that I was concerned about, and just to sort of give a little bit of background, Nancy, amazing people in my office like Katie Hope, work with the Women's Center, led me to bring a notice of motion several years ago, calling for a renewed commitment to gender equity and diversity. And council was amazing and supported it with intentionality, and administration, you know, was awesome about it. And we took, you know, the age friendly and the youth friendly and the gender equity and diversity, and we put it into the social Wellbeing Advisory Committee. And, you know, I wonder if that's enough, you know, and I think I was reaching out to you guys a year ago because I was concerned that you guys were not, and I apologize for using the term guys. Whenever I go to the Women's Center and I say you guys, I have to put the tuning.
Keeping track. I'm keeping track.
Yeah, just keep digging it up. My bill is getting bigger. But, you know, I approached the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee with the intent of sort of like helping to dig in and sort of figuring out how we can really get you to be more of an action, you know, support you in becoming more action oriented. And then right when that was happening, Black Lives Matter exploded onto the world. And we all pivoted from having a conversation about the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee to how do we conduct in a good way an inquiry into systemic racism and all of that stuff. So these are very live issues. If I could ask you, Nancy, you know, listening to Danisha's lived experience, attaching that to the historical sort of background you gave us, can you give us your best attempt as a historian to write a history about right now and how we find ourselves? So can you give us a thesis statement about right now as a historian? Because we have to pivot in this conversation towards the future and the moves we need to make, which is exactly what we were talking about or seeking to talk about with our social well-being advisory committee. But Nancy.
Yeah, I was just on an organizing committee for a conference called Between Post-War and Present Day, which is 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, we're still very much in this neoliberal moment. And like, as I'm sort of starting to do some work on the Alberta Status of Women Advisory Committee, it is, you know, in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was this moment where feminists were fighting to push the welfare state and to push for a stronger welfare state that would be able to understand the different experience of women, and Indigenous women were challenging the women's movement to think about how to decenter white women from those analyses, right? And so there was this great push and this kind of hope and optimism that the state or government policy can go bad, but not to give up on the possibility of government doing good, right? And that was challenged by the new right and Thatcher and Mulroney, right? There's no such thing as community, et cetera, et cetera. And so then I remember, like, you know, my Marjorie Griffin Cohen free trade report was my supervisor. And she's like, now we just have to fight for the horrible policies we have to make sure they're not cut. Like she said, like, so we have to, I think what we need to do with this movement is to understand and figure out how to regain some sort of hope in the possibility of government, right? And that hope rests on getting people like Danisha in government, frankly, right? And for sure at the policy table as the first step, right? And so I think, you know, trying to change and looking to the past, because we're not the first people who've been fighting against you know, governments or businesses saying that we can't afford to do this, right? And so I think that's sort of how we're grappling with the past and the present and the future.
Well, I mean, that resonates exactly with the offering I'm putting forward as my re-election platform. I mean, you guys know I'm an urban design nerd. I love physical city building, and I believe very firmly that how we physically build our city can either support or undermine our march towards a more equitable society. But I'm putting, that's not on the back burner, but that's a foundation for the idea. Like, I've been radicalized by COVID, and, you know, I'm saying we need to build an equitable Calgary, a Calgary for everyone. I'm saying that, you know, we learned through the pandemic that we're all in this together. If you didn't learn that we're all in this together, I mean, and that's what I find so amazing about the people who are denying the pandemic. It's that it's a refusal to admit or to agree with the blatant reality that we're all in this together, and we have to start tackling the things that we're all in this together about. And so climate change is a big one, but, you know, universal everything, like childcare, like dental care, like, you know, we need to get like a basic income guarantee. These are the things that are now on the table because of what this pandemic has done. And then the final thing that you spoke to, Nancy, we can't neg government, like this, you know, multi-decade sort of mission to destroy government, which is the perfect expression of how we're all in this together. We have to double and triple down as Canadians on our good old fashioned value of good government, as colonial as that might be implicated. It's one of our strengths. So anyway, throwing back to you.
Well, I mean, I'd also say, I mean, building also on what Danisha said, and what we're talking about is centering poverty reduction, right? And anti-poverty activism and the voices of anti-poverty activism in building this future, right? I mean, one of the things we thought we would talk about, and certainly the domestic violence rates are going up, right? And have been going up as women have been trapped in their homes and don't even have work as that safe space in this moment. And I mean, my first book was about setting up shelters for battered women in the 1970s and into the 1980s in small towns. And I also did research for the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children. And I wrote a report on how the social welfare state and or the social welfare policies in British Columbia at the time were deepening or making it difficult for Indigenous and racialized women to access those programs because they didn't understand the history of the 60s scoop and things like that. But what I came out of that report with is, poverty reduction has to be at the center of organizing against violence against women, because that's why women stay, right? It's the economic manipulation and the economic abuse and the inability, right, to find a good job in which they can, and affordable housing is central to that as well, right?
Agency, yeah.
Yeah, so bringing poverty to the
healthcare, access to health, like childcare, but also access to recreation that's affordable and all the things that you need to live a full life, which is going full circle, what municipal government sort of sits at the center of being able to provide and work with citizens or not. Danisha, I feel like you've been
quiet.
No, I've been learning. This is great for me, just personally, to learn about the history. I think going back to your question about social wellbeing advisory, I think it is a great first step. I think you're right. There's a lot more work that has to be done that maybe was paused the last year, but also at the same time, I think the last year was needed to propel us forward on what our future looks like, what our priorities should be. And again, going back to the systems, I think social wellbeing has the foundation to bring people together with lived experience, with expertise. But I also have, I guess, questions for you too, Gian-Carlo, around there's a lot of work that has been done by the YWCA around moving to a feminist economic recovery.
You guys don't want a bro-covery? No bro-covery?
Not right now. Maybe
something more equitable. Okay.
There's also multiple elections coming up at different levels, and I think we need to really talk about. Nancy brought it up, representation for sure at the decision-making table. It's not just in politics, but corporations, social impact sector, everywhere. And I know, Gian-Carlo, you've answered some specific questions for Ask Her, which I'm sure we can post later and it can be found on their website. But I'm curious as to, in your perspective, you're a white man running for re-election, and there's a lot of people that say, why aren't you making space for a woman to run? Or even how would you and your platform specifically, and like, I think I know some of the answers to this because of our relationship and the fact that you've mentored me and supported me in my leadership in Calgary. But in general, how are you as a white man going to be propelling women forward at the decision-making tables?
Well, I mean, those are great questions, and I appreciate that. The first thing I'll say is that it was not my intention to seek a fourth term. 11 years of public service is a big chunk of time, and it's hard on the family, even granting the fact that I am a man and I don't bear a lot of that brunt, even though I try and shoulder my fair share. And my wife, who's a CEO, carries a lot, and I'm aware of that. But I would say that I sought a successor, and I worked in a mentorship role with a couple of amazing women who were very much my ideal for who a successor would be. And the reality is that politics is tough, and COVID made life harder, and their ability to change their life and commit to the crazy act of trying to get elected wasn't working out. And so my mentorship in that regard sort of fell apart, and I was faced with a difficult question, which is, how do you move forward? Writ larger, I think the city is approaching a huge existential moment in its history. I think this is the moment where historians will say, and at that point, Calgary faded from relevance, or at that point, Calgary rose on its strengths as a great Western Canadian place to make a great Canadian life, as a beacon of equity, as a leader in climate action, and as a place of really good government in a modernizing world. So That's the big question that's before us. We've got 11 members of council who are not coming back. So the opportunity for renewal, the opportunity for making space for more new and better representation, more diverse voices is absolutely there. I believe that, as we did the deep dive into systemic racism, it became very clear to me that it is very unfair to suggest to ethnocultural groups that their job is to dismantle systems of oppression that keep them down. In fact, it has to be the white majority that rolls up their sleeve and does that. And I've committed to that. And so I think that there's an important role for white cisgendered me's of this world to take that on and to be serious about that, especially in the light of the existential crisis and the massive turnover that's occurring. And then there's the final sort of like just brass knuckle politics answer is that if I were to walk away from Ward 9 right now, and I'm not considering my reelection to be, ordained, I think this is going to be a very tough election for me to win. But I think if I wasn't running in this race, you would absolutely get someone who is antithetical to my mission and vision elected instead, given the electoral politics of Ward 9. So I'm holding the fort here and committed to making committed to all the things I've committed to, which include very seriously gender equity and diversity. Does that answer your question? I mean, I'll throw that back at you. Why are you supporting my candidacy, Danisha? Because you are publicly doing so, and I really, really appreciate that. And you as well, Nancy.
Yeah, no, I think for me, and I'm supporting you as someone who lives in your ward, because I've seen the work that you've done, not just on social wellbeing advisory, but the people, and I think a big thing for me is you being a white man is surrounding yourself with diverse women in your office. And I often have felt that in politics, the elected official is a very small part of the work that gets done. Once you're elected, it's the people that you surround yourself with, making those decisions. And to be very frank, I like the people that you surrounded yourself with.
They reflect well on me, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. And that's a big reason why. I've only lived in Calgary for 2 years, so I've had to be a fast learner on politics in our ward and the work that's being done at the city council level and at the administration level, given my role. And I've been very, I think our values align, which is definitely a foundation as to why I vote for anybody, regardless of party or partisan or at whatever level. But I would say, yeah, the big thing for me is that I often find that you can't call yourself an ally, but others that you're trying to be an ally to are the ones that can call you an ally if that's what you are. And for me as a racialized woman, with my lived experience, with my role in various committees in the social impact sector, like for me, I can confidently say that you're an ally. And that's why I'm comfortable voting for you.
That's high praise. Thank you. And I mean, I don't actually, it's not my intention for these conversations to be about that, but this is important and central to the project. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. We've got very little time left. And so I think that what we really need to do is just make some bold statements about the future and the work that needs to be done and the story we need to tell ourselves as Calgarians when we walk into the voting booth, on October 18th, and possibly weeks before that at the federal election, and then 2 years later at the provincial election. These are big historic shift moments, and there are big forces at war. And I think it's important that we clarify, the story and the action. Nancy, what do you got for us?
Just the public good, right? That there is a public good to which we are all contributing, and that we need to think about what the legacies of our decisions today will be on future generations. We've talked, I'm not a parent, but certainly I have students who are very concerned about climate change and are very deeply concerned about truth and reconciliation and about anti-racist action, right? And so that we need to make sure that we're electing people who think that government is for making change that will advance equity and that will actively seek to develop programs that understand the systemic roots of inequities. I'll stop there, Danisha.
Thank you, Nancy. Danisha?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really about post-pandemic resilience. Again, with youth, I think definitely candidates that are talking about not just economic security, and which is important, but also about systemic racism, people who are talking about childcare, who are talking about representation, but who are talking about, I think, a few things that have really stood out the last year, which is mental health and isolation and anxiety. Because I think if you're looking long-term at future generations, at our youth who are going to be our future leaders, we need elected officials, we need people surrounding them that are not afraid to make change, who are not afraid to get their hands dirty. Because I think for me, I'm at a point right now where you can talk policy and you can talk about what change you want, but unless you have a plan, like I said, to be able to do these things, I don't want to wait another 4 years for having the same conversation in 4 years because we screwed up today.
I appreciate that. I'll just throw in that we're at a really interesting moment in history, I believe. And as far as the structure of the city of Calgary and its commitments, I think we're in a good place to make meaningful change. But this election will determine that. So, we do have the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee. We have the Racism Action Committee. And then we've got, of course, CALAC, which is our Calgary Aboriginal Urban Committee, with an emerging Office of Indigenous Affairs. And those groups, we really have to supercharge their ability to plug in and really make their voices heard with the council that is elected. We also have a city that is in the middle of a significant reorg out of like a 1980s neoliberal corporate widget building structure to an organization that's designed around building, great, equitable, complete neighborhoods, networked together with sustainable infrastructure, nestled into a sustainable region. So, all of these things can line up beautifully and we can make really thoughtful decisions together moving forward. But that'll only happen if it happens.
And if I can add, when you talk about the committees, I think the people that are on these committees are great, but let's also think about the barriers for others who cannot get on these committees. I remember when I applied to this committee when I first moved here, it wasn't a small feat, like having technology access, having access to a computer, all of that stuff. I think we're missing a big chunk of people who might not have those skills or those opportunities or platforms. And how are we getting them to the table? Because I still think even with the diversity, the representation on the committees we have now, there's a big chunk of people missing.
So, and I agree with you. And I'll just throw out like one of the core points of Great Neighborhoods, which is still the organizational sort of drive doing my work, is that we really have to decentralize into the community level and really give capacity there. So, we're talking about individual boards in a city of 1.4 million people. There's that, but then there's the ability to sort of dig in really equitable, well-governed local institutions that bring everybody together. And I think that those are really the training grounds for giving those are the democratic training grounds, and we have to deliver on those as well. Nancy, you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I was going to say that, but I was just going to say, like, taking it out to the community. But the other thing to think about in terms of economic resiliency and what is going to drive the economy, of Calgary, because it's pretty clear through global that it's not going to be oil, gas in the same way, is that making sure that as we're seeking out those other industries, that we're making sure that we're not allowing industries like tech is really bro, right? I say that as somebody whose partner has been in tech, that we're making sure that we're
you said tech is really bro?
Bro.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, bro. BRO. And that we're making sure that as we're seeking out industries, that they are going to be committed to gender equality and racial equality as well. Right.
I completely agree with all of that. And, I personally have really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoy the history, Nancy. I enjoy the lived experience. I feel like I know you both a lot better, and I really value that. Any closing statements, Danisha?
No, I think it's just have people learn and reflect and make good decisions going to the ballots at whatever level of government, but we can't afford to be naive and ignorant anymore. We just can't.
Nancy, closing statement?
Things are not inevitable, right? That's one thing we learned from history. Like, we have this neoliberal consensus because
The end of history is not actually a thing. Eh?
No, that it's been over 50 years of activism to undermine the social welfare state. So we have to fight that by fighting for governments that will do good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's really given me a renewed and enhanced sense of purpose as I step into an election that's going to be ugly and is high stakes. But I'm very hopeful for the city, and chatting with amazing people like you makes me even more hopeful and gives me a real sense of purpose. So thank you so much for the work you do, and let's make sure that we do everything we can to get Calgarians to the ballot box in droves, telling the right story about where we're at, because we're more informed about where we've come from, and we're more thoughtful about where we want to go together. We want to rise together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.